Hello and welcome to the channel, The Calm Historian. Before we begin our journey into the past, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any calming stories in the future. If you enjoy this format, don't forget to leave a like and feel free to comment below. Let us know what time it is, where you are, and from where you're watching. It's fascinating to think about how we're all connected, coming together from different parts of the world to experience a peaceful historical journey. Now that we're all settled in, let's transport ourselves to the distant days of the medieval era. Today we'll take a slow and steady look into the life of medieval archers, people whose daily existence was filled with hardship and pain. We won't rush and we won't dramatize, but we will dive deep into the details, exploring their grueling training, their constant struggles, and their role on the battlefield. Imagine yourself stepping into this world where every day was a battle, not only against the elements, but also against time and exhaustion. Prepare yourself for a journey that's calming and reflective. There will be no rush, no urgency, just a quiet walk through history, allowing us to explore how these archers lived, worked, and survived. The pace will be gentle, guiding you towards relaxation, leading you into a state of comfort and quiet reflection. So, let's begin our journey together. Imagine a place where everything was governed by ancient traditions and harsh conditions. Narrow village streets lined with weathered houses with thatched roofs, and endless forests where the sounds of distant animals occasionally interrupted the stillness. In this world, time moved differently. There were no streetlights, no rapid communication, and everything around a person was about labor and survival. At the heart of this world were cities and castles, symbols of power where kings and lords tried to maintain control over their lands. But the life of an ordinary person, especially that of an archer, was filled with struggle. In the medieval era, when bows and arrows were the primary means of defense and attack, armies were made up not only of knights, but also of common people ready to become weapons in the hands of their lords. But their lives were far from easy. Each day was filled with pain and fatigue, from which there was no escape or relief. Archers were not as revered as knights, but they played an important role in battle. They stood at the front, shooting arrows from a distance, providing support for the knights, and defending their land from invaders. But behind this lay long-term training and hard work. Before they could even raise a bow, a person had to spend many years training, mastering the art of archery, and learning endurance. Every archer went through many stages, from a novice to a master of the craft. But no matter how important their skill was, in the realities of war, it didn't always bring instant glory. Often, the archer remained in the shadow of the knights, their labor often taken for granted, seen as something simply expected. This created a unique perception of the archer's life, something painful, but necessary, constant, and invisible. In this world, full of both shadow and light, the life of an average archer unfolded. Though their days were filled with struggle and hard work, each of these moments was part of their everyday reality. We won't rush. We will move slowly, paying attention to every detail of their lives, every aspect of their existence. Think about how all of this might have felt to someone in those times, the pain, the hardships, and even the small moments of relief that came with rest. Step by step, we will delve deeper into the history, examining what it truly meant to be an archer in this difficult historical period. Now, let's take a moment to relax and begin our journey, leaving the noise of modern life behind as we slowly immerse ourselves in the measured flow of the past. Imagine, if you will, the figure of a medieval archer. His life was far from glamorous. Unlike the knights who donned shining armor and gallantly charged into battle, the archer was a quiet figure, often forgotten by history, yet no less essential. His work was not about glory or chivalry. Instead, it was about discipline, repetition, and endurance. The archer could come from many different walks of life. Some were peasants, drafted into service when their lord called upon them. Others were young men eager for a steady wage or the promise of adventure, though the reality of their work was often a far cry from the excitement they had imagined. But no matter their background, to become a skilled archer required years of training, patience, and above all, a willingness to endure hardship. It was not a life chosen lightly. It was a life shaped by necessity, by the harsh realities of medieval warfare. The early days of training for an archer were often filled with frustration. Think of the young peasant boy who first picks up a bow. His hands are unfamiliar with the grip, and the longbow feels heavy, awkward. The string pulls against him with a force he cannot yet control. The arrows, often crude and poorly crafted, don't fly straight. The bowstring might snap, and the body quickly grows sore from the strain. The work is exhausting, and yet there is no room for rest. The young archer, like all who would follow him, must continue. Day after day, he pulls the string back, releases, and adjusts his aim. Each motion is a lesson, and every failure becomes a stepping stone to mastery. As the years pass, the bow becomes an extension of his body. The weight of the longbow, once nearly unbearable, now feels like second nature. His muscles grow stronger, and the repetition of training builds a rhythm, one that he could do with his eyes closed. But no matter how strong he becomes, the work is never easy. The longbow was a formidable weapon, but it was also a demanding one. Drawing the string required immense physical strength, often as much as 100 pounds of force. A bowstring would snap under such tension if not properly maintained. And the arrows, though essential, were often simple and poorly constructed, and they could break or splinter during battle. There was no glory in the struggle to make a good shot. It was simply part of the work. It was not just the physical demands of archery that wore an archer down, it was the mental strain as well. Imagine the constant discipline required to practice over and over again, often in cold, wet weather. The archer had to learn to ignore discomfort, to keep his mind sharp even when the body begged for rest. He had to develop an understanding of his bow, of how each draw felt, and how each release differed depending on the position of his hands, his body, or even the wind. There was little room for error. A missed shot could cost a life. As the archer's skill grew, so did his place in society. While knights were admired for their bravery and their glorious charge into battle, the archer's role was more quiet and less celebrated. Archers were often considered second-class soldiers, lower than the knights and nobles who commanded them. And yet, their skill was indispensable. When kings or lords raised their armies for war, it was often the archers who were called upon first. While the knights prepared for close combat, it was the archers who formed the first line of defense, firing arrows from a distance to weaken the enemy before the cavalry even got close. Archers would spend long hours standing in formation, their bows raised, their eyes locked on the distant enemy. The air around them might be filled with the whistling sound of arrows, the smell of damp earth, and the tension of waiting for the inevitable clash of armies. As they released their arrows, the archers knew their work was far from over. They would need to reload quickly, fire again and again, all while the battle raged around them. It was not a role for the faint-hearted, but it was a role that required an incredible amount of focus and endurance. Some archers, especially those who came from wealthier backgrounds or who were able to afford the proper training, might have joined the ranks of the royal armies, gaining some measure of respect for their skills. Others, though, were mercenaries, hired swords who traveled from one battlefield to the next, never quite sure where their next paycheck would come from. The mercenary life was a perilous one. One day, they could be fighting for a noble cause, and the next, they could find themselves on the losing side, abandoned and left to fend for themselves. There was little security in this life, but it was a life that offered opportunities for those who could navigate its uncertainties. The majority of archers, however, were peasants who lived in more stable conditions. They might be part of a local militia or serve in the army of a local lord. These archers often lived quiet, unassuming lives, training in their free time, supporting their families, and waiting for the call to war. But even this life was filled with hardship. There was no glamour in the work, the training, the constant waiting, and the uncertainty of when or where they would be called to fight. Yet, despite this, these archers were often the backbone of medieval warfare. They might not have had the same prestige as the knights, but their skill was just as vital. For all archers, the life was one of routine and repetition. They spent hours every day practicing, adjusting their technique, perfecting their aim. But in the silence of their practice, they found a certain peace. When they gathered around the campfire after a long day's work, their boughs leaning against the nearby trees, they could find comfort in knowing that they had done their duty. Their work, though often thankless, was essential. And when they could rest, even briefly, it was a reward in itself. Being an archer was a life of endurance, both physical and mental. It was a life that required constant sacrifice, but one that was necessary for survival. It was not a life of glory, but it was a life of quiet strength, marked by dedication and the slow, steady pursuit of mastery. Imagine a young archer, barely old enough to understand the full weight of the responsibility ahead of him, but already holding the bow. It is a simple thing at first, a wooden stick, nothing like the polished weapon of a seasoned warrior. His fingers wrap awkwardly around the bowstring, and he pulls it back, but it feels as though the string is too tight, too unyielding for him to handle. His arms tremble from the strain, and he struggles to steady the aim. The first time he draws the bow, it feels unnatural. The weight of the bow presses down on him, and his shoulders ache from the effort. The arrow feels heavy in his hand, its shaft smooth but stiff, almost too long to manage properly. He notches the arrow, but the tension between his fingers and the string feels like a constant pull on his muscles. The first shot is a failure. The arrow doesn't hit its mark, and perhaps it doesn't even hit the target at all. It falls short, or it flies too wide. But this is how it begins for many. The early days of training with a bow are filled with frustration. For some, there's a sense of excitement, a longing to become skilled, but that excitement is tempered by the reality of the work. There is no glamour in the early days. The bow feels like a weight on his shoulders, and every shot feels like a reminder of how much more he has to learn. But this, too, is the nature of the craft, the repetition, the trial and error, the need to fail in order to grow. Over time, the young archer will grow more accustomed to the feel of the bow. His fingers will become more sure, his muscles stronger. He will learn how to hold the bowstring with just the right amount of tension and how to relax his grip when necessary. He will learn how to keep his shoulders steady, how to draw the string back slowly but surely, and how to let the arrow fly with precision. But even as he practices, his body will ache. His arms will grow tired, his fingers will blister. Each movement, once awkward and uncomfortable, will begin to feel like second nature. The bow itself is an instrument of both power and subtlety. When the string is drawn back with great force, it hums under tension, vibrating slightly with the energy waiting to be released. It is a sound that becomes familiar, almost soothing over time, though it carries with it the heavy weight of the work ahead. The arrow, once released, zips through the air with surprising speed, its shaft slicing the wind with ease. And yet, the archer knows that it's not just the speed of the arrow that matters, it's the accuracy, the skill, and the consistency of each shot. As he continues to practice, the young archer learns to recognize the tiny shifts in his technique. The angle at which he holds the bow, the alignment of his arms, the tension in his muscles, all of these things must be perfect in order to make a successful shot. But even when everything seems right, sometimes the arrow still misses its mark. It is a constant reminder that mastery is a slow process, and even the smallest mistake can make a big difference. When the young archer begins to see some success, it's only a small victory. He might hit the target once, but that success is fleeting, soon overtaken by the need to continue practicing. There is no end to the work, only constant improvement. And with each improvement, the bow feels more natural in his hands, and the arrows fly more true. But no matter how much he learns, the first few years will always be the hardest. The pain of those early days is almost constant. The muscles in his arms, shoulders, and back ache from the repetitive motion of drawing and releasing the bowstring. His hands, rough from the constant grip of the bow and the arrows, will blister and callous. But with time, his body adapts. He becomes stronger, more capable of handling the heavy bow and the tension of the draw. His hands no longer ache from the pressure, and the repetitive motion becomes as easy as breathing. Even when the young archer finally feels the satisfaction of hitting a target, the reward is fleeting. The true test comes when the bow must be drawn in a real situation, when the archery is no longer a simple exercise, but a life or death task. In battle, there is no room for mistakes. The target is not a stationary target. It is a moving, shifting mass of enemies, many of them armed and ready to fight back. But for now, the young archer's world is one of slow, steady progress. The bow and arrows are not yet weapons of war. They are tools of personal development. He will learn patience, endurance, and precision. He will learn to be silent and focused, to listen to the quiet hum of the bowstring and feel the shift of energy as the arrow leaves the string. As he looks at his target, he doesn't yet understand the true weight of what he is training for. But in time, the bow will become an extension of his body. The tension between his fingers and the string, the feeling of the arrow leaving the bow with perfect accuracy, all of this will become second nature. For now, though, it's simply a long road ahead. And each day spent training is another step towards mastery. As our young archer continues his training, the days stretch on, one blending into the next. In the beginning, each day feels like an eternity. The muscles in his arms, back, and shoulders ache from the constant strain of drawing the heavy bowstring. His hands are raw from the friction, calloused and blistered as they grip the rough wood of the bow. His body grows accustomed to the repetitive motions, yet there's no getting around the fact that each session is grueling, physically demanding, and at times discouraging. Training is not just about learning technique, it is about building endurance. The archer learns early on that the bow is a tool of constant repetition. There is no shortcut to mastering it. Each shot is a small, deliberate motion. Draw, aim, release, repeated thousands of times until it becomes second nature. Every day, he must perfect the same motion over and over again. His form must be flawless, and every shot must be consistent. It's exhausting work, and there are no easy days. The young archer begins his training by shooting at stationary targets, sometimes at great distances, sometimes at closer ranges. But no matter the distance, the process remains the same. He must position himself carefully, taking into account the wind, the weight of the bow, and the tension in his muscles. His arms must be steady, his aim unwavering. A single shift in posture, a tiny misstep, and the shot misses its mark. The early mistakes come often. It's frustrating knowing that his body is capable of more, but that his mind and muscle memory are not yet aligned. Sometimes he pulls the string too far back, causing the bow to snap against his wrist, leaving a bruise. Other times, the arrow simply doesn't fly straight, veering off course due to slight imperfections in his technique. The young archer begins to learn patience, understanding that every failure is part of the process. There is no room for pride in the early days of training, only humility and persistence. The more mistakes he makes, the more he learns, and the more his body becomes conditioned to the demands of the bow. The pain, however, is constant. The physical toll of constant training is unrelenting. The archer spends hours each day on his feet, holding the bow, drawing the string, releasing the arrows. Each motion requires precision, but also strength. His arms, once weak and untrained, begin to grow stronger, though they will never escape the constant ache. The bow may become an extension of his body, but it will always be a heavy one, and no amount of practice will ever fully eliminate the strain. At times, he must train in less than ideal conditions. The weather does not always cooperate. Rain may soak his tunic, the wind may whip his arrows off course. But these conditions are part of the reality of medieval life. There are no breaks for bad weather. A soldier must be able to perform in the worst conditions, and an archer must learn to adapt. Training in the cold, wet mornings or under the blazing afternoon sun becomes as much a test of endurance as it is a test of skill. The ground beneath him is often uneven, the dirt soft and yielding beneath his boots, making it hard to maintain balance. And even when conditions are perfect, the body grows tired. The muscles begin to feel like they're being stretched too thin. Still, he continues. He must. Training is not just about repetition. It is about building mental fortitude, the ability to push through physical discomfort and exhaustion. The archer learns to ignore the pain in his body, to focus on the target and nothing else. It's a kind of meditation, the slow, steady rhythm of drawing and releasing, all while the mind remains focused. There is no room for distraction. Each shot requires complete concentration. As his training progresses, he learns to block out the noise, the chatter of fellow soldiers, the distractions of the world around him. His world narrows to just himself, the bow, the arrow, and the target. And yet, even as the training continues, the archer begins to wonder whether it will ever feel natural. The bowstring digs into his fingers, the muscles in his back protest each time he draws the string, and the repeated motion wears on him. Some days are easier than others, but there are days when it feels like no progress is made, and the fatigue threatens to overwhelm him. In those moments of doubt, the archer must remember why he is training. He is training for survival. He is training to protect himself, his comrades, his land. In the heat of battle, the moments of pain and frustration during training will be forgotten, replaced by the single, vital need to survive. But for now, the archer focuses on his training. It is, after all, the only thing that will prepare him for what lies ahead. The harsh reality of training is something every archer must endure. No matter how difficult it becomes, there is always more to learn, always another level of skill to reach. With each repetition, the archer builds his endurance. With each painful shot, he moves one step closer to becoming a master. And though the journey is long, the rewards, the small victories, make it worth every drop of sweat, every ache, and every bruise. As the archer's training progresses, the physical demands of his weapon begin to take their toll. The bow, once an awkward object he struggled to draw, has become a constant companion, but with that familiarity comes an unrelenting strain on his body. The repetitive motions, the weight of the bow, the tension in his arms, and the pressure on his fingers are no longer just minor inconveniences. They are part of the physical toll that a life as an archer demands. Picture a typical training day. The archer wakes at dawn, muscles stiff from the previous day's practice. The cool morning air bites at his exposed skin, but he pushes forward. He pulls the bowstring back again, feeling the resistance of the wood, the tightness in his chest as his lungs take in shallow breaths, and the strain in his fingers as they grip the string. With each pull, his biceps burn, his forearms cramp, and his hands ache from the constant pressure. The draw becomes more familiar, but the fatigue is always present. Over time, his body begins to adapt to the strain, but it is never easy. The shoulders, once weak and unused to the weight of the bow, now begin to take on more of the load, growing stronger but also stiffer. His neck becomes tense, and the small muscles in his back become accustomed to the repetitive strain. The archer's body is constantly under pressure, as though it is being shaped into something new, something more resilient. But no matter how much his body adapts, there is always a sense of underlying tension, the ever-present reminder of the weight he must bear. The fingers, in particular, suffer. The constant friction from the bowstring creates calluses, hardening the skin, but these calluses, while protective, also make the fingers less sensitive. Over time, they become tough, but the constant motion still takes its toll. The archer's hands often swell, and blisters are common when they begin their training. The bowstring burns the fingers after each shot, and after hours of continuous practice, the feeling of holding the bow becomes almost numb. It is a testament to the endurance the archer must develop, a resistance to the discomfort, a quiet acceptance of pain. In addition to the strain of shooting, the archer's body faces further challenges from the repetitive nature of his daily duties. Archery is not a static task. There is no simple, single motion. The archer must maintain his stance for long periods, his legs planted firmly in the ground, his feet adjusted to different angles depending on the terrain. The slightest shift in balance can cause fatigue, so the archer's lower body must remain in perfect harmony with his upper body. Standing in one place for long hours can create cramping in the legs, sore joints, and aching feet. This physical stress is compounded when the archer is required to stand at attention for hours before the battle, when the body is tense with the anticipation of what is to come. It is a constant battle against discomfort, and the archers must learn to manage it, to endure it without complaint, because there is no one to sympathize with them. Their bodies are their tools, and they must push them to their limits. In the field, conditions are no better. The weather, as always, plays a crucial role in how the archer performs. If the rain falls, it soaks the bowstring, making it more difficult to pull back. If the wind blows, it disrupts the flight of the arrows. But the real toll of the bow comes when the archer must fight on uneven ground, perhaps in the muddy, slippery fields of battle, or on a rocky hilltop, struggling to maintain balance as he draws his bow. Each step is more difficult, each shot becomes harder to make. The bow, which is heavy and unwieldy when held for long periods, becomes a burden, and the archer must dig deep into his reserves of strength just to continue. The archer's body is both his asset and his limitation. His endurance is built from years of physical and mental toughness, but the body can only take so much. The constant strain of holding the bow, drawing the string, and releasing the arrows wears the archer down, and though his body grows stronger, it is always under threat of injury. Muscle strains, joint aches, and the overuse of certain tendons are common afflictions that the archer must contend with. Even small injuries like a sprained finger or a torn muscle could be debilitating if not treated properly. In time, the archer learns to move through the pain. His body becomes accustomed to the exhaustion. He finds comfort in the rhythm of the draw and release, the steady motion that becomes almost hypnotic. His muscles ache less as they grow stronger, and his mind grows sharper, more focused. The fatigue that once seemed overwhelming becomes a familiar companion. The archer knows that the pain is temporary, that the target is worth the effort, and that survival, for both himself and his comrades, depends on his ability to endure. But it is not just physical endurance that is tested. It is the mental fortitude to keep pushing through the pain. The archer's mind must be as strong as his body. The fatigue sets in slowly, and every day of training brings him closer to exhaustion. But there is no room for weakness. There is no time for self-doubt. The archer, if he is to succeed, must continue to push, even when every fiber of his being cries out for rest. Each shot becomes a test of willpower, to ignore the discomfort, to focus solely on the target, and to master the weapon that demands everything from him. In this way, the archer's training is as much about perseverance as it is about skill. He learns not just to shoot with accuracy, but to endure the physical and mental toll of his craft. His body is shaped by the bow, and in return, the bow becomes an extension of himself, his strength, his determination, and his ability to push past his limits. As the archer grows more skilled, another critical aspect of his craft becomes apparent: the constant need to maintain his equipment. A bow, like any weapon, is not impervious to wear and tear. Every string pulled, every arrow shot, gradually diminishes its power and precision. The archer, while training his body, must also train himself to care for his tools, for without properly maintained equipment, even the strongest of archers is rendered ineffective. The bow, at first, feels like a simple piece of wood, but as the archer becomes more proficient, he realizes its complexities. Every part of the bow, the wood, the string, the limbs, tamund, is subject to the forces of use. The string, which is pulled back again and again with immense pressure, begins to lose its strength after repeated use. It may fray, snap, or stretch out of shape, causing a loss of power in the shots. A weakened string is more likely to snap during practice or battle, which could spell disaster. The archer must carefully check the string for wear, replacing it at regular intervals to ensure the bow functions as intended. The limbs of the bow, too, face constant strain. The repeated tension from the draw weakens the wood, and over time it may warp or splinter, causing the bow to lose its shape and effectiveness. To maintain the bow's integrity, the archer must regularly inspect the limbs for cracks, ensure they are properly aligned, and, if needed, carefully reshape them. This requires an understanding of both the mechanics of the bow and the patience to work with it. The archer becomes not only a soldier, but also a craftsman, responsible for the condition of his weapon. For the arrows, the challenges are slightly different. While the bow may be the archer's most important piece of equipment, the arrows are his primary tools of engagement. The arrowheads, made of iron or steel, must be carefully honed to a sharp point to ensure they penetrate armor or flesh. A dull arrowhead, no matter how expertly shot, is less likely to cause significant damage. Over time, even the best crafted arrowheads dull, and the archer must spend time grinding them to a fine point again, ensuring they are sharp and lethal. The fletching, the feathers attached to the tail end of the arrow, also requires maintenance. Over time, feathers can become bent, torn, or damaged from use, disrupting the flight of the arrow. A bent fletching causes the arrow to wobble mid-flight, diminishing its accuracy. The archer must have a steady hand and an eye for detail when he repairs the fletching, reattaching the feathers with precision to maintain the arrow's aerodynamic quality. This delicate work requires the archer to be both meticulous and resourceful, often repairing his own equipment while out in the field. Another crucial part of the archer's equipment is the quiver. The quiver holds the arrows and must be positioned carefully to allow quick and easy access. During battle, the archer must be able to reach for a new arrow without hesitation, drawing it swiftly from the quiver and loading it into the bow. A poorly designed quiver, one that is too bulky or too small, can slow the archer down, costing him precious moments during the heat of battle. The archer becomes intimately familiar with his quiver, adjusting its placement, learning its quirks, and ensuring it is always in good working condition. But it's not just about maintaining the equipment itself. The archer must also take care of his body and his gear in tandem. For instance, in battle, if the archer's bowstring becomes wet from rain, it can lose its tautness, making it harder to draw the string back. In such situations, the archer must take the time to dry his bowstring, possibly finding shelter or creating a fire to help preserve the integrity of his weapon. This constant awareness of his equipment and its needs, especially under stressful conditions, means that the archer's responsibilities are never finished. Every day he must check and recheck everything, his bow, his arrows, his string, his quiver, to ensure they will perform when needed most. The archer's armor also requires attention, though it is often much lighter than that of a knight. Unlike the heavily armored knights, archers usually wore simple padded coats or leather armor, designed to offer some protection without hindering their movement. Even this light armor, however, wears down with use. Leather may become cracked or brittle, and padding may lose its ability to cushion. Just as with the bow and arrows, the archer must take time to maintain his armor, patching up small rips or re-oiling the leather to ensure it remains flexible. In addition, an archer must often carry spare parts. Extra bowstrings, additional arrows, and even tools for making quick repairs during battle are a part of his load. Every piece of equipment must be checked regularly, and the archer must be prepared for the worst. A broken bowstring or a snapped arrow may happen at the most critical moment. Preparation is key to survival. As the archer gains more experience, he learns the subtle art of managing his equipment while maintaining his skill. He becomes more adept at quickly assessing the condition of his bow and arrows, replacing broken parts, and making adjustments on the fly. His ability to maintain his gear in peak condition could mean the difference between life and death. A well-maintained bow can outlast its owner, while a neglected one could fail in the heat of battle, leading to catastrophe. Through this constant cycle of repair, maintenance, and use, the archer develops a deep, almost symbiotic relationship with his weapon. The bow is not just a tool of war, it is an extension of himself. The better he cares for his bow, the better it will perform, and the better he will perform in turn. The bow, the arrows, and the archer, they are all connected by this unspoken bond of care, strength, and survival. As the archer trains and prepares for battle, his body, though strengthened through rigorous practice, faces yet another set of challenges: the harsh realities of food and health in the medieval world. Unlike the well-fed knights or wealthy landowners, the archer often had to contend with meager rations, poor nutrition, and a constant struggle to maintain his energy and strength. Imagine the archer, after a long day of practice, trudging back to camp or his barracks. He's weary from hours of shooting, his body aching from the strain of drawing the bow, yet the day is far from over. He must still find something to eat, but food is never a certainty. In the medieval world, a soldier's diet was simple and often unsatisfying. The archer, like many of his comrades, might have had access to bread, cheese, and a small portion of meat. But if the campaign stretched on, or if food supplies were running low, the meals became more sparse. If the archer was lucky, he might find some porridge or stew filled with grains or vegetables, enough to keep him from starving, but not enough to fully sustain him. The meat, if available, might be tough and salted for preservation. Salted meat, though vital for long journeys or sieges, could become both unappetizing and difficult to digest after days of eating it. Water, often the only available drink, might be brackish or contaminated, offering little refreshment. In the midst of training or during long marches, it wasn't uncommon for food to run out entirely, forcing the archer to go without for days on end. During these times, the body would start to break down. The energy that had once been used for training or battle would quickly dwindle, leaving the archer fatigued, weak, and susceptible to illness. Prolonged hunger and malnutrition often led to a weakened immune system, making it difficult for the archer to recover from even the most minor injuries or wounds. In these conditions, the archer's health became a precarious balance. The body was constantly on the edge of depletion, fighting to maintain enough strength to continue training and eventually fight. But even if the archer could find food, it didn't always provide him with the necessary nutrients to perform at his best. Without proper sustenance, his body would begin to suffer. His strength would wane, his concentration would falter, and his ability to recover from physical exertion would diminish. In addition to malnutrition, the archer's body was at constant risk from the elements. Whether it was the dampness of rainy weather or the scorching heat of summer, the archer was often exposed to the harshest of conditions. Imagine the cold winds blowing through the ranks of archers, their hands stiff from the chill, their fingers numb from holding the bow. A slight drop in temperature could lead to frostbite, while exposure to rain could result in muscle cramps and joint pain. When the archer falls ill, there is no quick remedy. Medieval medicine was rudimentary at best. The archer might be given some herbs or potions to ease his discomfort, but true healing was often a matter of waiting it out. Diseases such as the plague, cholera, or dysentery could easily spread through a camp, claiming the lives of many soldiers, including archers. For a medieval soldier, surviving the battlefield often meant surviving the constant threat of illness as much as it did surviving the fight itself. In battle, the archer's health was further compromised. Injuries were inevitable, whether from the debris of arrows shot in return or from the brutal hand-to-hand combat that often followed. Arrows might pierce armor, but they could also tear through flesh, leaving painful, festering wounds. Without proper medical care, even a minor injury could lead to a serious infection. The archer's wounds might become infected, leading to fever, swelling, and potentially death. The most tragic part of the archer's health struggles, however, was the lack of rest. In the medieval era, sleep was a luxury. Archers, along with the rest of the army, would often sleep in makeshift tents, barely able to stretch out. The discomfort of sleeping on hard ground, under the open sky, or within damp, musty tents further weakened the body. On campaign, sleep deprivation became a norm rather than an exception, and the physical toll of lack of rest compounded the exhaustion of fighting and training. Even when not on campaign, archers lived in constant readiness, unable to rest fully. The looming possibility of battle or sudden attack meant that their bodies were always tense, never fully relaxed. Their minds, too, were constantly alert, aware of the potential danger and the need to stay vigilant. While they might have longed for a proper bed and a warm meal, the reality of their existence made these desires feel distant and unattainable. Despite all these challenges, the archer's body had to continue its relentless march. The long hours of practice, the pain of aching muscles and joints, the constant struggle for nourishment, all of these were part of the reality of the archer's life. And yet, he would push forward. Every injury, every missed meal, every sleepless night would become a part of him, slowly hardening his resolve. It was a life of constant discomfort, but also of perseverance. The archer learned that survival, in both battle and in everyday life, depended on his ability to endure hardship without faltering. As the young archer grows into his role, he begins to understand the physical toll that his craft requires. The constant strain of drawing a heavy bow, the repetitive nature of his movements, and the prolonged hours spent in training or on the battlefield all contribute to a series of injuries, both minor and severe. In the world of the medieval archer, there is no such thing as a day without some form of discomfort, whether from a scrape on the hand or a more serious injury, like a broken bone. Imagine the feeling of holding the bowstring, the pressure in your fingers and arms as you draw it back. Over time, even the smallest strain from repeated movements can lead to injury. The bowstring might snap too harshly against the archer's wrist, causing bruises or swelling. This injury, though seemingly minor, can slow the archer down and become a constant irritant, a painful reminder that the body is not invincible. But more serious injuries are a constant threat. When the archer is not practicing, he might be out on the battlefield, where the risks are far greater. Arrows are flying in all directions, some of which may find their mark, while others may miss their target and strike someone else. In close combat, where archers are sometimes thrust into the fray, the potential for injury increases. An archer might be struck by an enemy sword or suffer a blow from a blunt weapon. These injuries could range from a cut or bruise to more serious fractures or contusions. The archer, already weakened by fatigue, must continue to fight or retreat, no matter the pain. Consider, too, the impact of standing for hours at a time, holding the bow, and waiting for the right moment to fire. The muscles in the back, shoulders, and legs tighten, and over time, they begin to ache. A small muscle strain might turn into something more serious, a chronic pain that the archer must learn to live with. It is a subtle but constant discomfort, a reminder of the wear and tear on the body. When the archer practices or fights for long periods without rest, the repetitive motion of drawing the string leads to overuse injuries. Tendons may become inflamed, and joints, such as the elbows and shoulders, may suffer from the constant stress of pulling back the bowstring. These injuries can limit the archer's ability to continue his work, but in the harsh medieval world, rest is often a luxury that cannot be afforded. When the archer is injured, he has no choice but to work through the pain, knowing that taking a break may be seen as weakness. More serious injuries, like a broken bone or a torn ligament, are even more dangerous. Without modern medical care, a broken bone might lead to long-term disability or even death. If an archer breaks a finger or a wrist, crucial parts of the body for drawing the bow, it may mean the end of his ability to fight or practice. But even worse, the lack of proper medical treatment means that such injuries can easily become infected. A simple wound, left untreated, can turn into something far worse, causing fever, swelling, and even death. Picture the scene on the battlefield. The archer, despite his injuries, continues to stand tall, firing arrows with the precision that his body, battered and bruised, can still manage. His arm might ache with every shot, his back might throb from hours of tension, but he keeps going. In the middle of a brutal war, when adrenaline and fear override physical limitations, the archer's body becomes a battlefield of its own, filled with pain, exhaustion, and the drive to keep moving forward. When the battle ends, the physical toll becomes all too clear. The archer returns to camp, his body stiff, aching, and covered in bruises. His skin is raw from the constant friction with the bowstring, his shoulders sore from carrying the weight of the bow, and his hands swollen from drawing arrows. The pain from injuries sustained in battle might not even be the worst of it. The wear and tear from days and nights of constant work on the field, the cold, the damp, and the pressure of a constantly tense body are just as debilitating. These are not wounds that can be seen easily, but are felt in every movement. In the aftermath of battle, the archer must take stock of his injuries. If he is lucky, his wounds are superficial, cuts, bruises, and abrasions that will heal with rest and care. But for many, the injuries are far more serious. Broken bones, deep cuts, or torn muscles might require long recovery periods, during which the archer is unable to do what he was trained to do. Even in the best of conditions, recovery is slow and painful. Without proper rest and medical care, infections and complications are a constant threat. The medieval archer's experience is defined by his ability to push through these physical challenges. Pain becomes a part of daily life, not just something to be avoided, but something to be endured. The true test of an archer's strength is not just in his skill with a bow, but in his ability to continue even when his body is in pain. Over time, the archer's body becomes a machine, capable of enduring the stress of training, battle, and injury. But it is not without consequence. The toll of constant strain and injury accumulates, and the pain, though manageable, is never fully gone. As the young archer grows into his role, he begins to understand the physical toll that his craft requires. The constant strain of drawing a heavy bow, the repetitive nature of his movements, and the prolonged hours spent in training or on the battlefield all contribute to a series of injuries, both minor and severe. In the world of the medieval archer, there is no such thing as a day without some form of discomfort, whether from a scrape on the hand or a more serious injury like a broken bone. Imagine the feeling of holding the bowstring, the pressure in your fingers and arms as you draw it back. Over time, even the smallest strain from repeated movements can lead to injury. The bowstring might snap too harshly against the archer's wrist, causing bruises or swelling. This injury, though seemingly minor, can slow the archer down and become a constant irritant, a painful reminder that the body is not invincible. But more serious injuries are a constant threat. When the archer is not practicing, he might be out on the battlefield, where the risks are far greater. Arrows are flying in all directions, some of which may find their mark, while others may miss their target and strike someone else. In close combat, where archers are sometimes thrust into the fray, the potential for injury increases. An archer might be struck by an enemy sword or suffer a blow from a blunt weapon. These injuries could range from a cut or bruise to more serious fractures or contusions. The archer, already weakened by fatigue, must continue to fight or retreat, no matter the pain. Consider, too, the impact of standing for hours at a time, holding the bow and waiting for the right moment to fire. The muscles in the back, shoulders, and legs tighten, and over time, they begin to ache. A small muscle strain might turn into something more serious, a chronic pain that the archer must learn to live with. It is a subtle but constant discomfort, a reminder of the wear and tear on the body. When the archer practices or fights for long periods without rest, the repetitive motion of drawing the string leads to overuse injuries. Tendons may become inflamed, and joints such as the elbows and shoulders may suffer from the constant stress of pulling back the bowstring. These injuries can limit the archer's ability to continue his work, but in the harsh medieval world, rest is often a luxury that cannot be afforded. When the archer is injured, he has no choice but to work through the pain, knowing that taking a break may be seen as weakness. More serious injuries, like a broken bone or a torn ligament, are even more dangerous. Without modern medical care, a broken bone might lead to long-term disability or even death. If an archer breaks a finger or a wrist, crucial parts of the body for drawing the bow, it may mean the end of his ability to fight or practice. But even worse, the lack of proper medical treatment means that such injuries can easily become infected. A simple wound, left untreated, can turn into something far worse, causing fever, swelling, and even death. Picture the scene on the battlefield. The archer, despite his injuries, continues to stand tall, firing arrows with the precision that his body, battered and bruised, can still manage. His arm might ache with every shot, his back might throb from hours of tension, but he keeps going. In the middle of a brutal war, when adrenaline and fear override physical limitations, the archer's body becomes a battlefield of its own, filled with pain, exhaustion, and the drive to keep moving forward. When the battle ends, the physical toll becomes all too clear. The archer returns to camp, his body stiff, aching, and covered in bruises. His skin is raw from the constant friction with the bowstring, his shoulders sore from carrying the weight of the bow, and his hands swollen from drawing arrows. The pain from injuries sustained in battle might not even be the worst of it. The wear and tear from days and nights of constant work on the field, the cold, the damp, and the pressure of a constantly tense body are just as debilitating. These are not wounds that can be seen easily, but are felt in every movement. In the aftermath of battle, the archer must take stock of his injuries. If he is lucky, his wounds are superficial, cuts, bruises, and abrasions that will heal with rest and care. But for many, the injuries are far more serious. Broken bones, deep cuts, or torn muscles might require long recovery periods during which the archer is unable to do what he was trained to do. Even in the best of conditions, recovery is slow and painful. Without proper rest and medical care, infections and complications are a constant threat. The medieval archer's experience is defined by his ability to push through these physical challenges. Pain becomes a part of daily life, not just something to be avoided, but something to be endured. The true test of an archer's strength is not just in his skill with a bow, but in his ability to continue even when his body is in pain. Over time, the archer's body becomes a machine, capable of enduring the stress of training, battle, and injury. But it is not without consequence. The toll of constant strain and injury accumulates, and the pain, though manageable, is never fully gone. As the archer endures the physical pain of training and battle, there is another aspect of his existence that takes its toll: the mental strain of long hours of waiting. While the physicality of archery requires strength, precision, and endurance, the mental toll can be just as taxing, if not more so. Archers often find themselves in a state of constant readiness, waiting for the right moment to strike, waiting for orders, and waiting for action that may not come for hours or even days. Imagine for a moment that you are a medieval archer stationed at the edge of a forest, crouched down in a small camp, waiting. The air is thick with tension, your bow is strung, your quiver full of arrows, and you are prepared for battle, but the hours pass slowly, one after the other. You are in constant anticipation. Will you be called to fight today? Or will you remain hidden in the shadows of the trees, waiting for a command that may never come? The long hours spent in waiting are an integral part of an archer's life. especially during sieges or other protracted military campaigns. Days stretch into weeks, with little to do but stay alert, remain still, and be ready to fight at a moment's notice. Time seems to crawl. In the silence of the camp, your mind is filled with doubt and uncertainty. What if the battle never comes? What if your bow remains useless, sitting idle by your side? This mental uncertainty, the waiting for action that may or may not come, is exhausting in its own right. The stress of this waiting period weighs on the archer's mind. The tension builds as the hours slip by, each one adding to the feeling of anxiety. The archer knows that during this waiting period his body remains on edge, and the effort to remain calm and focused can be just as draining as the fight itself. Unlike knights who may have an idea of when they'll be called into battle or what their role will be, the archer's job is often less predictable. The archers must wait, stay silent, and conserve their energy, all while the battlefield and the threat of death loom just beyond the horizon. In camp, the archer has limited options for distraction. There are no modern comforts, no leisure time to unwind. Perhaps there's a simple campfire where a few of the archers exchange quiet words, sharing the bond of their shared struggle. But for the most part, the archer is left alone with his thoughts. He may try to sleep, but the anxiety of being unprepared, of not knowing when he will be needed, makes rest nearly impossible. Even when he does rest, his mind is never truly at ease. He may dream of battle, of the sound of arrows cutting through the air, or of the horrific consequences of not being ready when called upon. For many archers, this mental strain becomes a constant companion. They are often stationed away from the main action, on the fringes of the battlefield, or in the thick of the woods, observing rather than participating. They wait for the signal to advance, to draw their bows, and to fire their arrows. In some ways, this can feel like an eternity. The hours feel like they are measured in tension, each passing second a reminder of the unpredictability of war. Even when the archer is not actively engaged in the battle, he is mentally exhausted from the need to stay alert, to always be on the lookout for danger. The uncertainty can affect the archer's confidence. When battle finally does come, the archer may have been waiting for so long that his mind feels clouded with indecision. Will his first shot land true? Will his arms have the strength to hold the bow steady after so much waiting? This period of inactivity is a double-edged sword. It preserves the archer's physical energy, but it erodes his mental stability, leaving him vulnerable to doubt and fear. The anxiety is not always just about battle. It is also about the fear of not being enough. Archers, though essential to the success of any campaign, were often considered secondary to knights and other warriors. While knights were celebrated for their courage and valor, archers often worked in the shadows, their contributions overlooked by many. This can create a sense of invisibility, of being less important despite the critical role they played. The archer's mental strain isn't just physical exhaustion. It is also a deep-rooted anxiety that stems from the uncertainty of their place in the larger context of the war. Imagine the archer watching as the knights, with their shining armor and grand steeds, prepare for the charge, while he is left standing, his bow ready but unused. The feeling of being passed over, of waiting while others march into the fray, is a heavy burden to bear. Yet this mental stress, this quiet frustration, is often a constant part of life for the archer. For some, the long hours of waiting lead to a numbness. They become accustomed to the anxiety, to the constant state of alertness. Their minds become accustomed to the wait, and over time, they learn how to manage the psychological burden. The archer learns to distance himself from the uncertainty, focusing on the task at hand, whether it is preparing his equipment or simply remaining alert. The feeling of helplessness may never fully dissipate, but the archer learns to accept it as part of his life. In the end, the mental strain of waiting can be just as exhausting as the physical challenges of archery. The constant tension, the anxiety of not knowing when the battle will begin, the fear of being overlooked, all contribute to the heavy burden carried by the medieval archer. And yet he continues, because that is his role. To wait, to remain still, and to be ready when the time comes to release his arrows into the fray. Once the battle is over, the long-awaited chaos has subsided, and the sounds of clashing swords and the cries of the wounded fade into the background. The real challenge begins for the archer. Recovery. The wounds inflicted during battle are not just physical. They are emotional, mental, and often long-lasting. For the archer, this period of recovery can be just as grueling as the battle itself. Picture the archer having spent hours on the battlefield, firing arrows, standing in one position for what seemed like an eternity. His arms are sore, his fingers stiff from pulling back the bowstring, and his body is covered in dirt, sweat, and blood from the violence of the encounter. The adrenaline of battle has begun to wear off, and now the true toll of the conflict becomes apparent. Though the battle may be won, it is the aftermath that tests the strength of the archer's spirit. The first thing the archer feels is exhaustion, an overwhelming, all-encompassing fatigue that takes hold of his body. The energy that had propelled him through hours of tension and fear now drains from his limbs, leaving them heavy and weak. The archer can barely stand as he looks around at the aftermath of the battle. The dead and the dying litter the battlefield, their bodies twisted in unnatural positions. The stench of blood and sweat is thick in the air, and the noise of the injured calling for help fills his ears. He has survived, but many of his comrades have not. In these moments, the archer's mind begins to process the horror of what he has just experienced. The reality of war is not always as heroic as it might have seemed in the tales of valor told by bards. It is often brutal, messy, and painful. The archer, who had once stood in readiness with his bow, now faces the harsh reality of what it means to be a soldier. For the archer, the battle is not just a contest of skill, but a test of endurance, of the ability to withstand not only the violence, but also the aftermath. The archer's recovery from the physical toll of battle is a slow process. Injuries are common, whether from arrows that have grazed his skin, bruises from the strain of holding the bow too long, or deeper wounds from the blades of the enemy. If he is fortunate, the injuries are minor, perhaps a sprain or a cut that will heal in time. But even these small injuries, left untreated or ignored, can become infected and lead to debilitating complications. The medieval world offers little in the way of medical assistance. There are no advanced treatments, no antibiotics to fight off infection. If an archer is injured during battle, the recovery process is long and uncertain. The archer must rely on crude remedies, poultices made from herbs, bandages fashioned from cloth, or even the skill of a fellow soldier who has rudimentary knowledge of healing. If the wound is serious enough, the archer may be forced to wait for days, even weeks, to fully recover, enduring pain as his body heals at a sluggish pace. The mental toll of the aftermath is no less taxing. The archer, having witnessed the brutality of battle, may struggle to come to terms with what he has done. He may have killed, wounded, or seen his comrades fall before him. The horrors of war often weigh heavily on the mind, and for the archer, there is little room for respite. The psychological scars left by battle can linger long after the physical wounds have healed. Many soldiers, including archers, suffered from what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The trauma of seeing death and destruction, of hearing the cries of the wounded, and of the constant fear of one's own mortality could leave deep emotional scars. But even in the face of this emotional exhaustion, the archer must continue. There is no time for true healing, no time for reflection. In the medieval world, life moves on quickly, and the army moves with it. The archer, once injured, is often expected to recover as best he can, rejoin the ranks, and prepare for the next battle. The harshness of medieval warfare meant that soldiers were often treated as expendable resources, their personal well-being secondary to the needs of the army. Even if the archer could not physically continue, he might be forced to march, to stand, to fight, whether or not his body was fully prepared. When the fighting ceases and the archer finally has a moment to rest, it is often a brief respite. The camp may offer a quiet evening, but the sounds of the battlefield still echo in his ears. The wounds of the past remain. In this brief moment of recovery, the archer might find comfort in small things: the warmth of a fire, a shared meal with fellow soldiers, or a few moments of sleep. But even rest is never truly peaceful. He is constantly aware of the possibility of another attack, another battle. The cycle of war, of conflict and recovery, repeats itself, a never-ending loop. And yet, the archer persists. For all the pain, the exhaustion, the suffering, he continues. The bond between the archer and his bow is strong, forged through years of training, pain, and hardship. The archer knows that no matter how many times he is injured, no matter how many battles he faces, he must always return to the bow. It is his weapon, his companion, and his tool for survival. His strength is measured not by how often he falls, but by how often he gets back up again. As the battle fades into history, it's easy to focus on the knights, the leaders, and the victories that made their names famous. In the pages of chronicles, it is often the knights in shining armor who are celebrated, their charges into battle immortalized in songs and stories. Yet, for the medieval archer, this glory was often out of reach. The contributions of the archers, so essential to the success of any military campaign, were often overlooked or forgotten, despite the immense sacrifices they made. The archer was not a figure of high nobility, nor was he often seen as the hero of the battle. While knights were celebrated for their courage and their chivalric virtues, archers remained in the shadows, performing their vital work quietly and without fanfare. Their task was simple yet profound: to release arrows with precision, to weaken the enemy before the knights and cavalry moved in, to provide support from a distance. But the archer's role was often seen as secondary, even by his own comrades. The truth is that for the medieval archer, glory was rare. While the knights received the accolades and rewards for their bravery in combat, the archer remained behind the lines, working tirelessly and often without recognition. He might not have worn armor that gleamed in the sun, nor did he wield a sword in the grand melee. Instead, he held a simple bow, its string pulled taut with the weight of countless hours of practice, and its arrows, sharp and lethal, aimed from a distance. In many ways, the archers lived in the shadow of the knights, unnoticed by the wider world, yet still playing an indispensable role. The knight with his shining armor and glorious charge into battle was the symbol of medieval warfare. But it was the archer, often working in silence, who turned the tide of countless battles. Whether it was the English archers at the Battle of Agincourt, where their relentless barrage of arrows devastated the French forces, or the longbowmen in countless other conflicts, the true power of the archer was often realized only in hindsight, after the battle was won. For the archer, however, the lack of recognition was not a new experience. From the very beginning, the archer had been relegated to a secondary role. The archer was often seen as expendable, a mere foot soldier in the eyes of the nobility. And even when he had proven his worth on the battlefield, his role was rarely celebrated. Archers, particularly in feudal societies, were typically peasants or common folk, conscripted into military service by their lords. They were not afforded the same privileges as the knights, who were granted land, titles, and status in exchange for their service. This lack of recognition weighed heavily on the archer. Despite their immense contributions, they rarely received the same rewards or privileges. The knight, after returning from battle, might be awarded land, wealth, or titles, his name sung in songs and celebrated by his peers. The archer, on the other hand, was often left to return to his humble life without the glory or the rewards. His triumphs, however significant, were largely ignored by the wider society. The archer's life was defined not by fame or recognition, but by duty and perseverance. He understood that his role was vital, yet he accepted the silence of his contribution without complaint. The archers knew their place, at the back of the lines, working tirelessly, firing their arrows with precision and discipline, while the knights took the glory. But even without the outward recognition, the archer's work was no less important. He was the foundation upon which the knights and armies stood, his arrows weakening the enemy, creating openings for the cavalry and foot soldiers to strike. And yet, once the battle was over, the archer would fade into the background, his work completed and his sacrifice largely unnoticed. Perhaps it is this silent contribution, this humble service, that defines the true spirit of the medieval archer. While his efforts may not have been celebrated, his dedication and sacrifice were no less real. He was a figure of endurance, of quiet strength, and of selfless service. In the grand scheme of things, the knight may have received the glory, but it was the archer who had often ensured the victory. In the quiet aftermath of battle, the archer would often find himself alone, contemplating the price of war. While the knights celebrated their victory, the archer might find solace in the knowledge that he had played his part, though no one else would remember his name. The lack of glory did not diminish the importance of his work. It was enough, perhaps, that he had survived the battle, that he had performed his duty with skill and precision, and that the battle had been won. And yet, for many archers, this silent contribution was not enough. There were those who longed for the recognition, who sought the praise that the knights received. They dreamed of the day when their names would be remembered, their contributions acknowledged. But for the majority, this was a dream that would never be realized. The medieval archer was destined to live in the shadows, forever serving, but rarely celebrated. While the life of an archer is often characterized by long hours spent training, waiting, and firing from a distance, there is another aspect of medieval warfare that demands attention: the moment when the archers are thrust from the periphery of battle into the heart of it. The transition from long-range engagement to close combat is a jarring shift for the archer, whose primary expertise lies in striking from afar. But in the chaos of medieval warfare, nothing is predictable, and even the archer must adapt quickly to survive. Imagine the battlefield as it unfolds, archers standing in neat rows, their bows raised and arrows ready, aiming at the advancing enemy. The clash of swords and the din of battle grow louder as the lines of soldiers approach. For the archer, it is a moment of extreme tension. Every arrow released a small contribution to the war effort, but a constant waiting for the inevitable. His role is to keep the enemy at bay, to reduce their numbers from a distance, and to protect the knights and foot soldiers by weakening the opposing force before a close combat ensues. But even the most seasoned archer knows that this delicate balance is fragile. As the battle draws closer, the archers begin to feel the heat of the conflict in a more visceral way. Arrows no longer fly only in one direction. They come back at them as well. The once peaceful landscape of an archer's focus becomes a deadly environment, with soldiers charging, enemy cavalry breaking through, and the realization that the bow is no longer enough. The archers, who had once been safely positioned at the rear of the battlefield, now find themselves at risk of being caught in the chaos of close combat. As the enemy draws nearer, the archers are often forced to drop their bows and take up swords, axes, or even the simplest of knives as they are thrust into the confusion of the melee. It is a jarring experience for the archer, who has trained for precision and patience, but now must face the overwhelming pressure of close-quarter fighting. In these moments, the archers face a brutal reality. Their years of practice with the bow, their understanding of long-range tactics, have left them ill-prepared for the brutal, chaotic nature of hand-to-hand combat. The skills required to fight at close quarters, to swing a sword or block an enemy's blows, are foreign to them. Their limbs, so accustomed to drawing bows and releasing arrows with precision, are now forced to swing weapons in a very different rhythm. The archer's mind, once focused on the simplicity of the bow, must now contend with the disorienting chaos of a battlefield. In some cases, the archers are forced into the fray not by choice, but out of necessity. If the enemy is close enough to charge, there may be no room for retreat. The archers, who are typically not trained in hand-to-hand combat, might be forced to rely on their ability to endure and survive, using their bows as makeshift clubs or their hands as weapons. The transition from precision to instinct is difficult, and often it is a fight for their very survival. When faced with this shift, the archer must remember that he is not alone. There is a camaraderie among soldiers, even among those who typically stand at a distance. The bond between archers and the infantry becomes stronger in these moments. Together, they fight side by side, archers drawing their swords, soldiers defending the lines, all trying to hold the enemy back long enough for the cavalry or reinforcements to arrive. The battlefield becomes a place of collective survival, a harsh reminder that no soldier is truly safe from the dangers of war, regardless of their station or training. For the archer, this is a time of great discomfort, both physically and mentally. He is a specialist in his field, but now he is thrust into an arena where his specialized skill is no longer the deciding factor. The battles that take place at close range, where swords clash, shields lock, and the noise of war fills the ears, are a different type of warfare. The archer must adapt, relying on whatever instinct and training he has in the moment to protect himself and his comrades. This shift from long-range warfare to close combat often brings with it a shift in the archer's mindset. At first, there may be a sense of fear or confusion. The archer, accustomed to the calm and controlled act of firing arrows, is now caught in a whirlwind of danger and chaos. But over time, if he survives the battle, he learns how to cope with the confusion. The adrenaline of battle sharpens his senses, and his body begins to move without thinking, just as it once did when drawing the bow. He becomes, in a sense, a soldier first, a warrior who must survive whatever the battle brings. After the battle, the archer will often reflect on the brutal nature of the fighting. His mind may return to the peaceful moments before the battle, when the archers lined up in formation and fired their arrows in unison, trusting in their ability to weaken the enemy. But now those days of relative safety are a distant memory. The world of the archer, once so ordered, has been upended by the violent demands of close combat. Though he may return to his bow after the battle, the experience of fighting at close quarters will stay with him, a reminder of the raw, unpredictable nature of war. The battle has ended, and the battlefield, once full of sound and fury, is now eerily quiet. The cries of the wounded fade into the distance, leaving only the soft rustle of the wind and the occasional moan of the injured. For the archer, the fight is over, but the recovery is just beginning. In the aftermath of battle, while the knights and commanders assess the results of the conflict, the real work begins for those who survived, the ones whose injuries, though not always as visible, will leave lasting scars. Imagine the scene as the archer surveys the damage. His arms are sore, his fingers swollen from hours of pulling the bowstring, and his body aches from the constant tension of battle. Though the adrenaline of combat has worn off, the effects of the physical and emotional toll are only beginning to take hold. The rush of action has passed, but the weariness remains, as does the quiet, gnawing pain of injury. The archers, many of whom were not trained for close combat, are now faced with a different kind of struggle. They may have sustained cuts, bruises, or even broken bones from the chaos of battle. Some may have been grazed by enemy arrows or struck by falling debris. For the majority, these injuries are not life-threatening, but they are painful and slow to heal. The reality of medieval medicine means that healing is not quick or easy. There are no antibiotics to stave off infection, no advanced techniques for managing pain. The archer must rely on the rudimentary methods available to him. A fellow soldier, perhaps with some basic knowledge of healing, might tend to his wounds, wrapping them in cloth or applying poultices made from herbs. But without proper care, even a simple injury can become a serious problem. An infected cut could lead to fever, swelling, and worse, the loss of a limb or even death. The archers, like all soldiers, must endure the pain, knowing that there is little recourse but to wait and hope that their injuries will heal on their own. But it is not only the physical pain that must be endured. The emotional toll of battle weighs heavily on the archer as well. For many, the experience of killing or wounding another human being is not easily shaken. While the archer may have been trained to think of the enemy as a target, a distant figure to be eliminated, the reality of battle is far more personal. The arrows that were fired in such cold precision now weigh heavily on the heart. The archer may be haunted by the faces of those he has killed or injured, by the thought of lives cut short by his hand. And then there are the comrades who fell alongside him. The archers, often a tight-knit group, feel the loss deeply. They may have fought together for years, sharing the same struggles, the same moments of victory and defeat. The loss of a comrade is not just a loss of life, it is the loss of a connection, a bond forged in the heat of battle. The archer, even if he survives physically, may carry the weight of that loss with him for the rest of his life. But despite the emotional and physical toll, the archer knows that recovery is not just about healing wounds. It is about finding the strength to continue, to keep moving forward, even when everything seems to be falling apart. For the archer, survival is a constant battle, not only with the enemy, but with himself. He must learn to deal with the pain, the loss, and the trauma, and to find a way to function once the battle is over. The return to normal life after battle is difficult, especially for those who have seen the horrors of war. Many archers find themselves unable to return to the simple routines of life before the war. The quiet life of training, the repetition of drawing the bow, seems distant and irrelevant after experiencing the chaos of combat. The archer may feel disconnected from the world around him, as if the events of battle have left a permanent mark on his soul. The very act of shooting arrows, once so familiar and comforting, may now feel empty, as if it no longer has meaning. Recovery is not only about healing physically, it is about rebuilding the sense of purpose that was shattered by the war. The archer must find a way to reconcile his actions with the reality of what he has experienced. It is a slow process, one that takes time, but eventually the archer must find a new balance between the man he was before the battle and the man he has become after it. There are moments of peace, brief, fleeting moments when the archer can look back on his service and find comfort in the knowledge that he played a role in the battle, that his arrows contributed to the victory. But those moments are rare. For the most part, the archer must continue with his life, carrying the weight of his experiences as best as he can. And so, the cycle begins again. The archer, though weary and scarred, prepares for the next battle, the next conflict, knowing that recovery is just another part of the price of war. He heals, but the scars, physical, emotional, and psychological, will remain. For the medieval archer, the path of recovery is a difficult one, but it is the only one that leads to survival. After years of enduring the physical and emotional hardships of being a medieval archer, the time eventually comes for him to lay down his bow. The warrior who has spent his life in the service of kings, lords, and armies now faces the inevitable question, what comes next? The life of a medieval archer is often defined by constant training, fighting, and recovery. And when that chapter comes to an end, the transition into retirement is far from easy. For most archers, the idea of an end to their service isn't something that's often considered during their years of battle. But as the years pass and the body begins to wear down, the archer must confront the reality that his bow and arrows will no longer be his tools of survival. For many medieval archers, retirement is not a simple matter of stepping away from battle and enjoying a peaceful life. Unlike knights, who often had land and titles to fall back on after their service, the archer had few guarantees. Most archers were peasants or common soldiers who had been conscripted into service, and upon the conclusion of their service, they were expected to return to their previous lives, which might involve returning to the fields, living in relative obscurity, and struggling to rebuild what was lost during their years in combat. The physical toll on the archer's body is often severe. After years of drawing a heavy bow, his arms and shoulders may be stiff with old injuries, his hands calloused and swollen, and his back aching from the constant strain. The long hours of training, the repeated motions, and the physical impact of battle have left their mark. Now, in his retirement, the archer finds that he can no longer perform the same tasks with the same precision and skill. The once strong muscles that had pulled the bowstring now ache with arthritis, and the grip that had once held arrows steady in the midst of a battlefield now falters under the weight of age. While some archers may have enjoyed a long, peaceful retirement in their later years, the reality is often different. Most find themselves struggling to adapt to civilian life. The same discipline and strength that served them well in the Army now seem out of place in the everyday tasks of farming, smithing, or whatever work they had once done before joining the military. Their bodies, worn from years of labor, may no longer have the resilience they once did. The once valued skills of the archer, the steady hand, the strong arm, may no longer serve them well in the quiet life they now must face. There is also the emotional challenge of retirement. Many archers, especially those who have spent decades in military service, struggle with the transition back into civilian life. War, for all its horrors, provides a sense of purpose, a clear goal, and a steady rhythm of action. But retirement is filled with uncertainty. The archer must now learn how to live without the constant tension of the battlefield, how to exist without the camaraderie of fellow soldiers, and how to cope with the silence of a life that once held so much meaning. The archer who has spent most of his life in service may feel a profound sense of loss when he is no longer needed. The quiet of retirement can be suffocating after years of chaos and constant movement. The friends and comrades who once stood beside him in battle may have passed away or moved on, and the world around him seems distant, almost foreign. The bonds of brotherhood that were formed on the battlefield are difficult to replace in the small villages or fields where the retired archer now resides. As time passes, some archers may find solace in a simpler life. They may take up farming or return to their old trade, finding peace in the rhythm of a quieter existence. For others, however, the lack of purpose can become unbearable. The memories of battle, the sounds of arrows flying through the air, and the adrenaline of combat may linger long after the body has stopped fighting. In such cases, the retired archer may become restless, longing for the days when his role was clear, when he knew his place in the world and had a defined purpose. For some archers, retirement is not a peaceful end. Many find themselves plagued by physical ailments that arise from their years of service. The constant strain on the body, the many injuries suffered during training and combat, can lead to a lifetime of pain. Chronic injuries, such as arthritis in the shoulders, elbows, and knees, make even the simplest tasks difficult. Wounds from battle, even those long healed, may flare up, reminding the archer of the life he once led. Sleep may come hard, as memories of war haunt the quiet hours of the night. In some cases, the retired archer might be able to find work as a trainer for younger recruits, passing on his skills to the next generation. But for many, this transition is bittersweet. The younger soldiers are stronger, quicker, and more resilient than the retired archer ever was. He may no longer have the same strength in his arms, the same sharpness in his aim. And as he watches the new generation of archers, he may feel a sense of both pride and sadness. Pride that his legacy will live on, but sadness that he can no longer fully contribute to the life he once knew. Retirement may come with a loss of status, too. While knights may retain their positions of respect, the archer often fades into the background. There is no noble title waiting for the retired archer, no estate to be inherited. He may have little to show for the years of service beyond the memories of the battles he fought in and the marks on his body that will never heal. His contribution, essential as it was, may remain largely unrecognized by history. But for the archer, it is the memories that will persist. Though his name may not be sung in the halls of kings, though his contribution may fade from the annals of history, he knows the truth of his service. He was there, at the front lines, his arrows flying, his body enduring, his mind focused on the task. His role was vital to the success of the battle, and he can take pride in that. As he grows older, the archer may find comfort in the quiet knowing that, despite the hardships and the lack of recognition, he fulfilled his duty, and he did it with strength, skill, and resilience. As the retired archer sits in the quiet of his later years, away from the battlefields and the days of active service, he may find himself reflecting on the life he led. Time has a way of dulling the sharpest memories, yet the essence of the archer's journey remains. His life was one of quiet strength, relentless dedication, and sacrifice. Though the glory of battle has long passed, the legacy of the archer's service endures, not in the songs sung about him, but in the lasting impact he made on the world around him. The archer knows that his role, though often overlooked, was integral to the success of the campaigns he fought in. He remembers the long hours of training, the endless repetition, and the grueling wait for battle. Yet, it was through this quiet preparation that he became a master of his craft, skilled with the bow and steady under pressure. It was not the clanging of swords or the charging of knights that defined him, but the discipline to shoot with precision from a distance, to stay hidden, to remain patient, and to persist despite the physical and mental toll. As he reflects on his life, the archer may find a quiet sense of pride in his service, even if no one else ever truly acknowledged it. He understands that the bow was not just a weapon, it was a tool of survival. Each time he released an arrow, it was an act of determination, of purpose. His skill, honed through years of practice, was a small but crucial piece of the larger machine of war. Without the archers, the knights would have been more vulnerable, the cavalry less effective, and the battle harder to win. His service, though silent and often unsung, was indispensable. There are moments when the retired archer may feel a pang of regret, a longing for the adrenaline, the purpose, the camaraderie of the battlefield. The quiet life of retirement may feel like a stark contrast to the rhythm of his former existence. He might find himself missing the simple, repetitive act of drawing the bow, feeling the string under his fingers, and releasing the arrow. But these moments of longing are fleeting, for the archer knows that a life without battle is one that allows him to heal, to reflect, and to find peace. The sacrifices the archer made throughout his life were many. He sacrificed his youth, his body, and at times his peace of mind. He gave his strength and endured physical pain for the sake of his comrades and his country. The memories of those who fell alongside him may linger, but they serve as a reminder of the bond shared among those who fought together. The archer, though not celebrated in the songs or praised in the halls of kings, knew the true cost of war. His contribution was essential, and he carried the weight of it with dignity. As the years pass, the archer becomes a part of history, though in a quiet way. He may not have been a hero in the traditional sense with titles, accolades, or songs written in his honor, but his life left an indelible mark. The skills he passed on to others, the work he did to protect his land, and the quiet endurance he displayed all form the legacy of the medieval archer. For many archers, retirement is not a final chapter, but a new beginning. It is the time to reflect on the years of service and to find a sense of peace after the chaos of battle. Some may find comfort in knowing that they were part of something larger than themselves, a collective effort that helped shape the history of their time. Others may struggle to reconcile the quiet life with the noisy, tumultuous years they spent on the battlefield. But in either case, the legacy of the archer is one of resilience, determination, and sacrifice. The life of a medieval archer was not an easy one, and it was not one filled with fame or glory. Yet, it was a life that required immense strength, both physical and mental, and a commitment to something greater than oneself. The archer's story is not one of grand triumphs, but of quiet, steadfast service. And in that service, the archer found his purpose, even if that purpose was only fully realized after the battle was over. In the end, the archer may rest easy, knowing that he did his part, that his arrows flew true, and that, despite the lack of recognition, he contributed to something that lasted beyond his own life. His legacy is written not in the pages of history books, but in the quiet strength he displayed every day, from the first moment he picked up his bow to the final days of his retirement. The life of an archer may not be celebrated in grand parades or immortalized in song, but it is a life of quiet, unwavering honor. Medieval warfare was not only marked by physical and moral challenges, but also by the harsh realities of logistics. Regardless of the military skill involved, soldiers, including archers, faced harsh conditions that often led to suffering, uncertainty, and even despair. The scarcity of food, water, weaponry, supplies, and medical care constantly threatened their survival and ability to fulfill their military duties. When an army set out on a long campaign, the issue of supply started right from the beginning. It was not always possible to provide an army with sufficient supplies of food and water. The only provisions they could carry were limited amounts of food, often rationed to last for a few weeks or less. Everything else depended on how successfully they could replenish supplies along the way. In the best-case scenario, the army could rely on gathering food from local villages or towns, but in the worst-case scenario, soldiers had to rely on seizing food from the enemy. The army on the march could not carry an enormous amount of supplies, so soldiers, including archers, often found themselves facing hunger. This situation led to low morale and exhaustion. Soldiers would lose strength, suffer from weakness, and experience extreme fatigue. Food that had been stockpiled would quickly spoil. Bread would go stale, meat would rot in the heat, and fresh water was often contaminated. An army, especially soldiers like archers, relied on its weapons, which needed constant maintenance and resupply. Bows, while effective, were fragile and required regular care. In the field, where professional weapon repair was not always available, gear often broke down. The army had to find ways to repair damaged bows, but these efforts were not always successful. Bows would lose their shape, arrows would break or become ineffective, and archers didn't always have the necessary tools to make proper repairs. Many soldiers, including archers, also faced the problem of gear becoming unusable. Sometimes weapons became so worn that they were no longer reliable. For example, old bows would lose their tension, and arrows used on campaign might not work well again due to damaged heads or diminished accuracy. In the absence of necessary equipment, soldiers often had to rely on campfires to both cook food and attempt repairs on their weapons. Food and water were, perhaps, the most pressing issues soldiers faced, especially during prolonged campaigns. Food became a luxury that soldiers often had to fight for, and in the absence of adequate resources, not everyone could expect regular meals. The food available to medieval armies often consisted of bread, salted or dried meat, legumes, porridge, and cheese. However, this was not a well-balanced diet, and soldiers commonly suffered from deficiencies, especially from a lack of vitamins. In the summer, meat would spoil quickly, while in winter, salting and smoking were the primary methods for preserving food. Water, on the other hand, usually came from rivers, lakes, or wells, but it was often contaminated or polluted, which could lead to diseases like dysentery or cholera. The army had to search for fresh water sources along the way, but when distances grew longer and supplies ran out, many soldiers died from dehydration. Archers, like all soldiers, had to endure this harsh reality, either losing strength from hunger and thirst or continuing to fight with little to no sustenance. On the battlefield, they were particularly vulnerable, as they were forced to stand in place for long periods with no opportunity to eat or drink. The shortage of food and water left them weak, which reduced their effectiveness in battle. Battle injuries were another serious issue for soldiers, including archers. Every soldier on the battlefield faced the risk of being wounded. With no antibiotics or modern medical treatments, even minor injuries could quickly become fatal. Archers, though they may have been positioned at a safer distance, were still vulnerable to enemy fire, with arrows and projectiles sometimes piercing through their armor. In close combat, swords and spears could cause severe injuries, often leading to long-lasting problems. The medical care available in medieval times was rudimentary at best, so soldiers had to rely on crude methods to treat wounds. Archers, along with others, were often forced to endure pain with little chance of proper treatment. In long campaigns, even small injuries could escalate into serious infections, as hygiene was minimal. During prolonged sieges or campaigns, armies often faced another problem: the inability to resupply. Both sides would attempt to block each other's supply routes, leading to shortages of food, ammunition, and other necessary items. In the case of a siege, for instance, the soldiers besieging a town could be just as starved and thirsty as the defenders. Sometimes resupplying the army was impossible, and soldiers had to rely on whatever they could find in the surrounding area. Even when supplies were available, the need to constantly maintain weapons and gear meant that soldiers had to manage their resources wisely. For archers, the shortage of arrows and the inability to replace them in the field often made them less effective, especially in the heat of battle. These constant shortages led to a continuous struggle for survival, both for food and for the means to fight. Historically, famous armies like the English archers during the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 struggled with the same logistical problems. Despite the pivotal role of the English archers in the victory, the long marches through France had caused food and water shortages, physical exhaustion, and morale problems. The soldiers were at their limit, yet they had to continue to fight. The logistical challenges made the army vulnerable, but the resilience of the archers and the ability to maintain their discipline despite those difficulties were key to the victory. However, surviving these conditions required immense endurance, not just of the body, but also of the mind. Soldiers had to adapt to the challenges of scarcity, using whatever they had to make it through. And it was not just their training that helped them. It was their resourcefulness, ingenuity, and will to survive under extreme conditions. Even when provisions were meager and hope seemed lost, medieval soldiers, including archers, found ways to push forward. In medieval armies, a deeply entrenched social hierarchy existed, and the relationships between soldiers of different ranks and functions were complex and often fraught with tension. Archers, in particular, occupied a unique and often marginalized position within the military structure. The medieval military system was heavily influenced by feudalism, a system where power, land, and military service were all linked, and this had profound effects on how different soldiers were perceived and treated. At the core of medieval society was feudalism, a system where land was the primary currency of power, and soldiers were often landless peasants or vassals who served under the lords or kings in exchange for protection, land, or the right to live on the lord's estate. This system created a rigid social hierarchy within armies, with knights at the top, followed by men-at-arms, infantry, and peasants who were conscripted or hired as archers. Feudal lords, the knights and high-ranking commanders, held the most power, often leading soldiers into battle. These leaders, typically from noble families, were afforded the highest respect and, in many cases, protected from the worst of battle. They would fight on horseback in shining armor, their wealth and prestige granting them an elite status within the army. Knights were also generally seen as the embodiment of medieval chivalry, courageous, noble, and deserving of respect. In contrast, the majority of soldiers, including archers, came from much humbler backgrounds. Most were peasants, commoners, or lower-class men who did not possess land or wealth. Archers, particularly longbowmen, were often seen as tools of war, their lives expendable in the eyes of the nobility. Though they played a crucial role in battle, archers lacked the status and recognition of knights and often faced a life of anonymity or even disdain. One of the most significant and glaring divisions within medieval armies was between knights and archers. Knights were typically from noble or landed families and were trained in the arts of war, combat, and chivalry from a young age. They were highly respected within the army and the society at large. Their role was seen as noble, and they were often given command positions and the best spoils of war. Their wealth and social standing also meant they had access to the best weaponry, horses, and armor. In contrast, archers were often peasants or landless men, forced into military service by their lords or seeking employment as mercenaries. Archers generally lacked the training, equipment, and status of knights. Their role in battle was not to engage in close combat, but to fight from a distance with the bow and arrow, often regarded as a less glamorous form of warfare. They were considered expendable foot soldiers, relegated to the periphery of the action, where they could fire arrows to weaken the enemy forces before the cavalry and knights charged in. This stark contrast between knights and archers often led to feelings of inferiority and resentment among the lower ranks, who were aware that their contribution was essential but rarely celebrated. While knights received titles, lands, and wealth from the king, archers typically returned to their humble lives, often without recognition or reward for their sacrifices. The relationship between archers and knights could be strained. Knights might look down on archers, viewing them as lesser soldiers, common in nature, their role seen as supporting rather than leading. This perception was reinforced by the idea that archery was not as honorable as fighting on horseback with a sword or lance. In battles, archers would often be placed at the back of the formation, firing from a distance while knights and other elite soldiers took center stage in direct combat. However, despite this division, archers were necessary to the success of military campaigns. The power of archers, particularly longbowmen, in battles like Agincourt, 1415, showed that they could significantly alter the course of warfare. Archers, though not given the same respect as knights, proved their effectiveness on the battlefield and became an essential part of medieval military strategy. Despite the social divide, they were seen as crucial for success, even if their efforts often went unnoticed or underappreciated by the higher-ranking soldiers. While knights looked down upon archers, there was often a stronger bond between archers and infantry, particularly foot soldiers. Archers and infantry shared common struggles, such as the harsh conditions of war and the lack of proper sustenance, rest, and medical care. Both groups, although different in their roles, were largely made up of commoners, often peasants or mercenaries, with little hope of upward mobility. Infantrymen, like archers, were typically foot soldiers who participated in close combat and were expected to fight at the front lines. Their role often involved holding ground, forming shields or pike walls, and supporting knights and archers during battles. Infantry soldiers usually had a more direct role in fighting, often bearing the brunt of physical combat. While archers were positioned to provide ranged support, infantrymen would be the ones to engage in hand-to-hand combat. Despite the difference in roles, there was a certain sense of camaraderie between archers and infantrymen. Both groups had similar experiences: harsh training, long marches, and lack of proper care. Infantrymen often respected archers for their skill with the bow, and archers, in turn, appreciated the bravery of the infantrymen who engaged in direct combat. They fought side by side, understanding that each role was vital to the army's success, even if their social status differed. The mutual respect between archers and infantry was often born out of necessity. If archers failed to provide adequate support, the infantry might be overrun, and if infantry were unable to hold their ground, archers could not make effective use of their ranged weaponry. Despite the social gap, these two groups often recognized each other's contributions, forming a kind of unspoken alliance, built not on noble blood, but on shared struggle and mutual dependence. Commanders in medieval armies were typically knights or higher-ranking nobles, and they wielded significant authority over all soldiers, including archers. These commanders were often appointed by the king or local lords and were responsible for leading the army, making strategic decisions, and ensuring that soldiers followed orders. The commander's authority was absolute, and their decisions often determined the success or failure of a campaign. For archers, the relationship with commanders was largely based on orders. Archers did not have much say in the decisions made during battles. They followed commands and were expected to perform their role without question. However, their effectiveness as soldiers, particularly in long-range combat, earned them a certain level of respect from commanders who recognized their importance on the battlefield. While archers were often viewed as lower in status, commanders understood that their success depended on the coordination of all units, from knights to infantry and archers. Archers were often used to weaken enemy lines before a knightly charge or to harass retreating forces. Although they were frequently underappreciated by their fellow soldiers, archers played a pivotal role in achieving victory. And commanders, though they might not publicly acknowledge it, depended on the archers' skills. At times, commanders might even take the time to improve their archers' effectiveness by providing better equipment, training, or tactical guidance. However, these improvements were rare, and archers often found themselves using worn-out or inadequate gear in battle. Nevertheless, their reliance on archers grew as warfare evolved, particularly as the longbow became an increasingly powerful weapon during the 100 Years' War. For archers, their role in the army was often filled with ambiguity. On one hand, they were proud of their skill with the bow and the important function they served in battles. On the other hand, they were keenly aware of their low status and the lack of recognition for their contributions. Archers were not knighted, nor were they likely to receive land or wealth from their service. Many archers, particularly those conscripted from peasant backgrounds, saw their role as one of necessity rather than honor. Archers who were part of mercenary groups might have had a slightly different perspective, driven by the prospect of monetary compensation rather than loyalty or fealty to a lord. They viewed their work as a way to earn a living, much like any other profession. In this sense, archers often had a practical, survival-oriented view of war, focused on completing their role as effectively as possible in exchange for pay, food, or shelter. However, for those who were part of feudal armies, the idea of honor and duty often outweighed personal gain. Archers might not have been celebrated as knights were, but they still held a sense of pride in their craft and a deep respect for the work they did. Their role, though not glamorous, was essential to the survival of the army, and many archers found satisfaction in knowing they played a critical role in achieving victory, even if their efforts would never be acknowledged publicly. Despite the social hierarchy and their relative lack of recognition, the legacy of archers is undeniable. Their contribution to medieval warfare, particularly with the rise of the longbow, fundamentally changed the dynamics of battle. Archers, though sometimes overlooked in historical narratives, played a crucial role in shaping military strategy and the course of history. Over time, the role of the archer would evolve. Their skill with the bow would continue to be valued, and their position within the army would become more respected as the art of archery proved to be indispensable. The social hierarchy within the army might have placed archers at the bottom, but their legacy remains one of strength, endurance, and quiet courage in the face of adversity. The evolution of weaponry in the medieval period, especially the advancements made in archery, profoundly influenced the tactics and strategies used on the battlefield. Archers, who were once considered auxiliary troops, eventually became key players in determining the outcomes of major battles. Over time, the types of bows, arrows, and accompanying weapons changed, as did the strategies for their use. As technology progressed, so too did the effectiveness and role of archers on the battlefield. At the beginning of the medieval period, archery in warfare was primarily dominated by the use of the shortbow, a weapon that was relatively simple to use but lacked the range and power of later innovations. The shortbow was typically made from a single piece of wood and was easy to craft, making it an accessible weapon for most soldiers, particularly peasants and lower-ranking soldiers. The shortbow was advantageous in certain contexts, particularly in dense formations and close-quarter fighting. It was smaller and lighter, which allowed archers to carry more of them, and it could be quickly drawn and released with relatively minimal effort. However, its lack of range and power made it less effective in large-scale battles, where the ability to engage at a distance was critical. In contrast, the longbow emerged as a superior innovation in medieval weaponry, offering greater power, longer range, and higher accuracy than the short bow. The longbow was made from a variety of materials, including yew, ash, or elm, and could be up to 6 feet in length, making it challenging to wield but much more powerful. Its design allowed archers to draw much heavier weights, with some longbows requiring a draw strength of up to 100 pounds, a feat that required both strength and training. The increased power of the longbow meant that it could pierce armor more effectively, making it a highly effective weapon on the battlefield. By the 14th century, the longbow had become the weapon of choice for many armies, particularly in England, where longbowmen played a pivotal role in battles like the Battle of Crécy, 1346, and the Battle of Agincourt, 1415. The longbow's ability to shoot long distances with great accuracy allowed archers to engage enemies before they even came into range of melee combat. The longbowmen could rain down arrows on the enemy, breaking their formations and causing massive casualties. This led to the development of specific tactical formations, such as the archer line, where longbowmen would form dense ranks behind the infantry, firing in coordinated volleys. The primary advantage of the longbow was its range. While a typical short bow had a maximum effective range of around 100 yards, the longbow could effectively shoot up to 200 to 250 yards, with exceptional marksmen capable of reaching even further distances. This advantage allowed archers to begin the battle from a distance, weakening enemy forces before close combat began. However, it was not just the range that made the longbow such a devastating weapon. It was also the rate of fire. A skilled archer could shoot 6 to 8 arrows per minute, compared to the much slower firing rate of crossbowmen, who could only fire 1 bolt every 2 to 3 minutes. This rapid-fire capability allowed archers to overwhelm enemies with a sheer volume of projectiles, causing confusion and panic within enemy ranks. Though the longbow reigned supreme for much of medieval warfare, the crossbow emerged as another significant innovation. Crossbows were considerably easier to use than longbows, requiring less physical strength to operate. As a result, they were accessible to soldiers of all levels, including those who might not have the strength or skill to wield a longbow effectively. The crossbow's ability to fire bolts with substantial force made it particularly effective against heavily armored knights, whose armor was often impervious to arrows from short bows. Unlike the longbow, the crossbow utilized a mechanical system that allowed the user to draw the string back using a lever, making it less physically demanding. The downside, however, was the slower rate of fire. A crossbowman would need to reload the weapon after each shot, which made crossbowmen less effective in rapid volleys compared to longbowmen. Despite this, crossbowmen had a significant role in siege warfare, where they could fire from behind fortifications and walls, and were also useful in battles against well-armored opponents. One of the main reasons crossbows were so effective was their ability to pierce the armor of knights. The high force generated by the crossbow allowed it to penetrate plate armor, making it a key weapon in battles where heavy cavalry was deployed. Crossbow bolts were often tipped with broadheads, designed to inflict maximum damage, and the mechanical nature of the crossbow allowed for more accuracy and power over a longer range compared to the short bow. While the bow itself was a significant technological innovation, much of the effectiveness of medieval archery came from the arrows themselves. Different types of arrows were used depending on the specific battlefield scenario, and innovations in arrowheads and fletching allowed archers to optimize their weapons for a variety of targets. Broadhead arrows. These arrows were designed with wide, flat tips meant to cause maximum damage upon impact. They were primarily used for cutting through the flesh and causing deep wounds, making them highly effective against unarmored targets. Bodkin arrows. In contrast, bodkin arrows had a narrow, pointed head designed to pierce through armor. They were especially effective against knights in full plate armor. When fired from a longbow, these arrows could penetrate chainmail and even some forms of plate armor, making them a key weapon against armored cavalry. Feather fletching. The fletching on an arrow, the feathers at the back, played a crucial role in stabilizing the flight of the arrow. Different cultures used various materials for fletching, including bird feathers, and the number and size of feathers could impact the trajectory and accuracy of the arrow. Technological improvements in fletching allowed for more consistent and accurate shooting, contributing to the effectiveness of archers. Flaming arrows. Though less common, flaming arrows were used during sieges to set fire to buildings, boats, and other structures. These arrows were tipped with flammable materials, such as pitch, and fired at enemy fortifications or ships. Poisoned arrows. In certain instances, poisoned arrows were used to increase the lethality of a shot. Although not widely used, these arrows were sometimes employed in covert warfare or to target high-value individuals, such as enemy leaders. The introduction of advanced weaponry like the longbow, crossbow, and specialized arrows revolutionized battle tactics. Archers began to take center stage in battles, especially during the 100 Years' War between England and France. Archers, often forming dense lines, would open fire before infantry or cavalry engaged, softening up enemy formations with a rain of arrows. This change in tactics rendered traditional forms of cavalry less effective and prompted new defensive measures, such as the use of crossbows to counter longbowmen. Archery formations became highly organized, with archers often being placed in strategic positions behind infantry or cavalry, providing ranged support. They could fire in volley formations, releasing waves of arrows simultaneously to create a wall of projectiles that would disrupt enemy lines. The English longbowmen, in particular, became a dominant force in European warfare during the 14th and 15th centuries. At the Battle of Agincourt, 1415, the English longbowmen decimated the French cavalry and infantry, inflicting massive casualties. This battle showcased the true power of the longbow as an offensive weapon capable of overwhelming heavily armored knights and cavalry. As weaponry evolved, so did the methods of deploying these new technologies. Archers became an integral part of military strategies, often deployed in high ground positions to increase their range or used in conjunction with infantry to create a layered defense. Siege tactics also evolved with the use of archers and crossbowmen, with these soldiers positioned to fire upon enemy walls or fortifications from a distance. With the advent of gunpowder and the introduction of firearms in the 16th century, the role of archers began to decline. Gunpowder weapons, such as the muskets and early rifles, offered greater power and range, eventually overshadowing the bow and crossbow. However, the longbow and crossbow had fundamentally altered warfare, paving the way for the development of more advanced ranged weaponry. In the transition to firearms, the tactical use of archers evolved, and their role in battle gradually became obsolete. But their legacy lives on in modern ranged weapons, and the innovations of medieval archery continue to influence military strategy to this day.